In this video, as promised earlier in the section, you're going to learn how to make HTTP requests to a given URL without using the request NPM library. Request is just an NPM library, and NPM libraries can't do anything that you could do with Node anyways. Typically, they just make it easier to do. And we saw that with Args and request. You don't need those to work with command line arguments or to make HTTP requests, but it sure does make the process a whole lot easier. Now in this video, we're going to explore how we can make requests using the modules that Node provides. This is a completely optional video as we're not going to integrate what we learn here into the weather application. Instead, we're going to just explore it over in the playground directory so we can get a better feel for what exactly the request module is doing. To do this, let's make a brand new file. I'll call this 6-raw-http.js, and in here, we're going to essentially recreate one of our HTTP requests, firing off the request to the server, getting and parsing the response, and doing something meaningful with it. To get this done, there are two core modules that we're going to explore. We can find those by cracking open the Node.js documentation in the browser. I'm going to close the Mapbox and Dark Sky API tabs since we're done with those, and I'm going to open up nodejs.org to explore the docs. Once we're here, we're going to go to the documentation page and we're going to go to the docs for our version. Now here we have the table of contents, which we've used before. For example, we explored the file system module earlier in the class. In this video, we're going to take a peek at HTTP and HTTPS. Now already we can see a bit of an annoyance. There are separate modules depending on the protocol we're using. With request, the NPM library, that's not necessary. It abstracts all of that behind the scenes, allowing us to easily switch out the protocol we're using without needing to load in a completely separate library. Now, if we crack both open, which I will in a new tab, we can take a quick moment to explore them before using them in our code. Now, both of these modules can be used for both pieces to the puzzle. You can use these libraries to create a new server, and we'll talk about server creation a bit later in the class. And you can also use these modules to make requests to an existing server, and that's what we're going to focus on in this video. As we scroll down through the table of contents for each, near the bottom, we're going to see a couple of methods, and the method we're looking for is request. Now, right here, we can use request with options or a URL with optional options. Either way gets the job done, and we're going to see the exact same thing for the HTTPS module. If I scroll down, we have those two ways that request can be called. So we use the HTTP module for standard requests, and we use HTTPS if we're making a request to a secure server. Now in this case, both of our APIs do use the HTTPS protocol, so that's what we're going to go ahead and use as well. Now, since it is a core module, as a reminder, there is no need to install it. We can simply load it in. Const HTTPS equals, we're going to require the HTTPS core module. And once again, the name I'm choosing to provide here comes from the documentation. If we scroll down to where we get to some examples, you're going to see that when they load it in, they use the HTTPS variable name as a standard. Now it's time to actually use the request function to fire off a request. In this case, let's go ahead and get the forecast for a location, though you could also use the same technique to geocode or interact with any other API. The first thing we need is a URL to make the request to. So I'm going to grab the forecast URL we had in forecast.js. I'm going to take the URL variable in its entirety with the contents as well. I'm going to copy the entire line, bring it over to our new file, and paste it in. Now we are referencing variables which no longer exist, so we can remove all of those. I'm going to remove the latitude, the comma, and the longitude, and I'll just replace that with some static inline values. For example, I can use 40, comma, minus 75, which is pretty close to where I am. Not exact, but it's good enough for this example. This is Andrew with a quick reminder that you should be using the new WeatherStack URL that you already had in place. So up top, I have the old dark sky URL, which I just added to the file. Down below, we have the new weather stack URL, which is the one you'll end up using. Now right here, I did remove the references to the latitude and longitude variables. I have set query equal to 45, minus 75. So this is the URL you'll end up using, and remember that later on when we explore the response, you'll end up seeing the response from WeatherStack, which we've already looked at, where we have the current property with our weather data. All right, let's jump back in to the lesson. Down below, it's now time to fire off the request, and we start that process with https.request. This is a function, so we're going to call it as such, and we pass to it two arguments. The first is our URL, which we have access to via that URL variable, and the second is a callback function, and this callback function gets called with the response. This is one last quick update for the lesson. Remember, with WeatherStack, we're using an HTTP URL since HTTPS is a paid feature. So instead of using the HTTPS core module like we're doing up above, we'll be using the HTTP core module like we're doing down below. So down below, you can see that for the new WeatherStack code, I've called the constant on line 1 HTTP, and I am requiring the HTTP module. Down there on line 4, you'll also see that I'm calling http.request instead of https.request. So these are the only changes we need to make. Just change those three instances from HTTPS over to HTTP and you'll be good to go. No other changes required throughout the rest of the lesson. All right, let's jump back in. Now the callback we use here is going to be very different from the callback we're used to like we had in the forecast or geocode file. Our core node modules typically operate at a lower level, while NPM modules like request abstract away a lot of that complexity. Since we are using the core node module here, we're going to have to set up things that you might not think should be necessary. For example, in this callback, we don't have access to the complete response body. Instead, we can go ahead and grab the individual chunks that come through because HTTP data could be streamed in multiple parts. So right here, what does that mean for us? It means we have to listen for these individual chunks to come in, and we also have to listen for when all chunks have arrived and the request is done. Right here, we can start this process by using response.on. Response.on is a function, and it allows us to register a handler. Now, there are a few different events we can register callback functions for. One of them is data, and we provide the event name as the first argument represented as a string. Now, from here, we can also provide the callback, and that's going to fire when new data comes in, and we get access to that data via the first and only argument, commonly called chunk. So this is a chunk of the response. It might be the entire thing, or it might not, depending on exactly how the server has been set up. Now, the other thing we're going to need to do in here is figure out when we're done. And we can do that using another call to response.on. Here we are waiting for the end event. When things are over, this callback function is going to run, and it doesn't get any arguments. Instead, by running, we just know we're done. So now it's time to put these two together to figure out how we can get the entire response body, parse it from JSON to a JavaScript object, and actually use it. So as mentioned, this callback is going to fire when data comes in. Now this could happen one time or it could happen multiple times. Either way, we need to take this chunk, we need to add it somewhere where we can store it until we have all of them, then we can parse it as JSON. So up above, let's get that done by creating a new variable. Let data equal an empty string. So here I'm using let instead of const since I am going to reassign the value over time, changing the string. Now inside of this callback, we're going to have access to that new chunk. Let's go ahead and see what the chunk looks like by console.logging it. So console.log chunk. Now you'll notice that the program in its current state is actually never going to run that code. Let's go ahead and prove it. cd /playground to get into that folder. I'll use clear to clear the terminal output and I'll run our script. That's the 6 raw http.js file. Now, when I run this, things are just gonna hang. It's not going to print our message, and it's not going to bring us back to the terminal for us to run another command. Instead, it's stuck. It's stuck because we don't have a complete request. There's another method we need to use to say we're actually ready to send this off. To do that, we have to make a change to our program. What we get back from the request method is what you could refer to as the request itself. So const request can store this variable, the variable that comes back as the return value from request. Now on here, there's a method we can use to kick things off. That is request.end. So right here, just another example of how the low-level API might not give us the exact tools we were hoping to. It can get a bit confusing even with a simple example. There's a lot going on here with very little progress. Now we can take things back to the terminal and rerun things. By calling end, it's going to see that we're done setting up our request, and it'll actually fire it off. If I do this, what do I see? I can see that right here we have a few different console.log calls printing various buffers, 3 of them, to the screen. So the chunk data that comes back is indeed a buffer. We want a string, so we're going to go ahead and convert the buffer to the string using the toString method as we've done earlier in the class, and we're going to add the data on to the data variable. So data is going to equal the old value for data plus the new chunk. So chunk dot right here toString to convert the buffer to a string. Now that we have this in place, we're going to have access to the entire value, the entire body response in the data variable. Down below in end, we can go ahead and access it, console.log data. Now, the data callback ran multiple times, once for each chunk. End is going to run a single time once things are done. Down below in the terminal, I'm going to rerun the program again, and what do we get? We get one thing printing to the screen. It is a very long string. This is our JSON data. So from here, we could go ahead and parse it to get an object that we could actually pull properties off of. So let's go ahead and get that done. Const, I'll call this something like response body or body equals. I will use JSON.parse to parse a JSON string, which I have stored in the data variable. Then I'll just print body, console.log body. Now if I save things and rerun the program from the terminal once again, we're going to see that instead of getting the long string, we get our parsed object. I rerun the program, and right here our object prints, and we could use this to grab the current temperature or grab the forecast for the next minutes, days, or hours. So this is what it takes to make a request with the core HTTP and HTTPS module, and we're not even really done yet because we don't have any error handling set up. Let's go ahead and wrap the video up by seeing how you could get that done. Just up above, between where we fire off the request and use end to actually send it, we're going to use request.on to set up another listener. Now, the event we're listening for here is error. This is going to get fired when an error occurs, and our callback function, which we provide, is going to allow us to do something with that error. Now, the error is the first and only argument, so we can go ahead and name it, and from here we could do whatever we needed to do with it. Now, in our other files, we used a bit of error handling to print one of 2 messages. In this case, let's go ahead and just dump it to make sure this is even running. So console.log an error. Then as the second argument, we'll actually dump it to the console. Now with this in place, we can go ahead and run the program generating an error. To do that, we can do something simple like turn off our network connectivity. I'm going to disable Wi-Fi on my machine. Then down below, I'm going to rerun the program, and what do I get? I get the error message looking exactly like what we had much earlier in the class when we initially explored the error in request. So now that we have this in place, we have a very basic HTTPS request with the core node module. As you can see, this does provide you everything you need, but at a much lower level than you probably expected. That's why in this class and in the real world, people aren't making requests with those core modules. Instead, they're using libraries like Request, Axios, or others to make the request process much easier. Here, our callback gets fired a single time when things are ready. We either have the error or we have the response, and the body's already sitting there. We don't have to do anything with it, like concatenate together the individual chunks to get everything we need. Now you might be thinking, why doesn't Node just change how those core modules work to be easier to use and look a little bit more like a library such as request? And that's missing the point. The core Node modules are supposed to provide those low-level implementations, and Node comes bundled with NPM because you're supposed to be using NPM modules when you're building out your applications. That's where we're going to stop for this bonus video. We took a dive into exactly how we could use the core Node modules to make requests, and we've learned a little bit more about why NPM libraries like request are so valuable to the Node ecosystem. That is it for this video, and that is it for this section. In this section, we learned all about asynchronous Node.js as we built out our little weather application. I'm excited to get to the next section. The section introduction is coming up next, so let's jump right in.